The history books of the 14th century call it the Great Frost of 1342, but hidden within the Vatican's sealed archives lies a much darker truth. It wasn't just a devastating storm. It was the night an exiled Omega bled on the snow, followed a phantom howl, and accidentally brought an empire to its knees. Historians have long debated the sudden and brutal collapse of the northern marches during the winter of 1342. Official records like those translated by Dr. Arthur Pendleton at Oxford in 1924 attribute the fall of the great medieval houses to plague and famine. But a collection of forbidden texts, specifically the Heatherton journals unearthed from a collapsed monastery in Northumbria just a decade ago, paints a starkly different, violently primal picture. It is a true account of lycanthropy, deep-rooted pack politics, and a catastrophic mistake made by a deeply arrogant man. At the center of this historical upheaval was Rosalind Heatherton. Born an Omega, Rosalind was theoretically the most protected member of the Montgomery pack. In the ancient werewolf hierarchies, Omegas were not the weak, submissive creatures modern lore makes them out to be. They were the emotional anchors of their packs, possessing a rare, neutralizing pheromone that could quell the bloodlust of frenzied warriors. But the year was 1342, a time of brutal territorial wars. Empathy was viewed as a liability. The alpha heir of the pack was Cedric Montgomery, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. Cedric was betrothed to Rosalind by the fates. The undeniable biological pull of the mate bond had flared between them when she turned 18. But Cedric despised what she represented. He wanted a warrior queen, a ruthless beta who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him in the coming wars against the southern rogues. He wanted Lady Katharina of the Iron Tooth lineage. The rejection took place on the night of the winter solstice. According to the translated accounts of Friar Thomas, a human sympathetic to the pack's workings, the great hall was packed with over 300 wolves. The fires roared, roasting whole stags, but the air was suffocatingly tense. Rosalind stood before the dais, draped in a simple, unadorned wool dress, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt the mate bond pulsing a warm, golden thread, connecting her chest to Cedric's. Cedric did not look at her with love. He looked at her like she was a stain on his grand tapestry. He stood silencing the hall. The winter is harsh and the weak must be culled, so the strong may survive. Cedric's voice echoed off the stone walls. He stepped down from the dais, his eyes flashing the terrifying gold of an alpha. I need a mate who can lead armies, not one who cowers to heal the wounded. Rosalind's breath hitched. Cedric, please, she whispered, the biological terror of rejection flooding her veins. To be rejected by a true mate was not merely a heartbreak. It was a physical tearing of the soul, a trauma that often resulted in the Omega's death from sheer shock. Cedric stepped forward, his claws extending just enough to catch the flickering firelight. He placed a heavy, unforgiving hand on her chest, right over her heart. I, Cedric Montgomery Alpha of the Northern Marches, officially and completely reject Rosalind Heatherton as my mate, my Luna, and my equal. The snap of the bond was violently audible, a sound like a heavy tree limb breaking under the weight of winter ice. Rosalind screamed a gut-wrenching, agonizing sound that forced several wolves in the hall to cover their ears. Blood poured from her nose, and she collapsed to the cold stone floor, convulsing as the biological tether was ripped from her nervous system. But Cedric was not finished. By the ancient laws of the solstice, a rejected mate cannot remain within the pack's borders, he announced, coldly turning his back on her writhing form. Strip her of the pack's colors. Cast her out. Lady Katharina stepped forward, a cruel smirk playing on her lips, and physically tore the heavy fur cloak from Rosalind's trembling shoulders. The storm raging outside was one of the deadliest in recorded European history. Temperatures had plummeted to a lethal degree. To cast an Omega out into the great frost was an execution plain and simple. 2 guards dragged the barely conscious Rosalind to the heavy oak doors, hauling her out into the blinding, screaming blizzard, and slammed the gates shut. Rosalind was entirely alone, dressed in nothing but a thin dress bleeding onto the snow, with the temperature dropping past lethal thresholds. But as historical archives reveal, Cedric's decision to banish her wasn't just about his pride, it was about survival. Rosalind had a secret. Just days prior, she had stumbled into Cedric's private study to bring him tea and noticed a parchment bearing the wax seal of the Southern Rogues. Cedric was planning high treason against the High Council of Wolves. He hadn't just rejected her, he had silenced the only witness to his impending betrayal. The wind felt like shattered glass against Rosalind's skin. The Heatherton journals describe the cold of that night as a physical entity, a predator, slowly sinking its icy fangs into her extremities. She dragged herself through the knee-deep snow of the Blackwood edge, her bare feet, long since numb, leaving a macabre trail of dark blood behind her. Her inner wolf was completely silent, curled into a tight, dying ball within her mind. The rejection had shattered her spirit, and the freezing temperatures were rapidly shutting down her organs. Just lay down, a deceptive, warm voice whispered in her mind. Sleep. It won't hurt anymore. She stumbled against the trunk of a massive pine, her knees finally giving out. The world was nothing but a swirling, chaotic whiteout. She leaned her head back against the bark, her eyelashes freezing together. The darkness was closing in a comforting blanket, threatening to extinguish her life. Then, a sound cut through the storm. It was not the wind. It was a howl. But it wasn't the guttural, frantic howl of the Montgomery pack. This sound was ancient resonant and impossibly deep. It possessed a baritone frequency that vibrated through the frozen earth and rattled the frost from the pine needles above her. It was a sound that commanded the very storm to quiet down. Rosalind's eyes snapped open. Her dying inner wolf twitched, suddenly alert. Through the blinding snow, a silhouette materialized. It was massive, easily the size of a warhorse. As it stepped closer, the moonlight pierced through a break in the storm clouds, illuminating a beast of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Its coat was entirely silver, gleaming like spun moonlight, but it was marred by violent, jagged scars across its snout and left shoulder. A silver wolf. In werewolf lore, silver coats were not just rare. They were thought to be extinct, wiped out during the first Lycan Wars. They were the mark of the sovereign bloodline, but Rosalind, delirious and dying, couldn't process the mythology standing before her. She only saw a predator. This is it, she thought. The fates have sent death to claim me quickly. She closed her eyes, exposing her neck in ultimate, peaceful submission. But the fatal bite never came. Instead, a wave of immense radiating heat washed over her. She opened her eyes to find the massive silver wolf standing directly over her, shielding her from the biting wind. The beast lowered its massive head, its intelligent, piercing, ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. There was no aggression in its gaze, only a profound, analyzing stillness. The wolf nudged her shoulder gently, with its wet nose, a clear command. Get up. Rosalind shook her head weakly. I can't! She rasped, her lips cracking and bleeding with the effort. The wolf released a low, rumbling growl that vibrated deep in her chest, warming her very core. It bit into the fabric of her ruined dress, not touching her skin, and hauled her to her feet with terrifying ease. It didn't let her fall. It pressed its massive, boiling hot flank against her freezing side, forcing her to lean her weight against it. Step by agonized step, the silver wolf guided the rejected Omega through the raging blizzard. They walked for what felt like hours, ascending the treacherous crags of the forbidden northern peaks. Finally, the wind died down as they crossed the threshold of a massive hidden cave complex. Deep inside, geothermal vents warmed the stone, creating a haven of steam and heat beneath the frozen earth. Rosalind collapsed onto the warm, dry stone, shivering violently as her body began to thaw. The silver wolf stood a few feet away, watching her. Then the sound of snapping bone and shifting muscle echoed through the cavern. Rosalind gasped, pushing herself back against the cave wall as the beast shifted. Rising from the steam was a man of towering stature. He was heavily muscled, covered in a network of battle scars that told the story of 100 wars. His hair was dark, falling around his shoulders, but it was his eyes that arrested her, the same piercing glacial blue as the wolf. He was terrifyingly handsome, radiating an aura of dominance so heavy it made it hard to breathe. But as he took a step toward her, he faltered. He gripped his side, a low hiss escaping his lips, and fell to one knee. For the first time, Rosalind saw it, a massive, oozing gash on his ribs, weeping black, toxic blood. Wolfsbane. He had been attacked, poisoned by high-grade liquid wolfsbane. "Who?" Rosalind croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The man looked up at her, his jaw tight with pain. "Alistair." He grunted, his voice a deep rumble that mirrored his howl. He offered no title, no pack name. He didn't need to. Alistair St. John was a ghost story, whispered to frighten disobedient pups. But Rosalind, sheltered and betrayed, didn't recognize him. She didn't know she was looking at the Alpha King of the continent, the sovereign of the frost, who had been ambushed by assassins just hours before the storm hit. Despite her own trauma, her Omega instincts, the very instincts Cedric had despised, roared to life. This man, this stranger, had saved her from the ice, and he was dying. Rosalind dragged her battered body across the cave floor toward him. Alistair tensed, a defensive growl rumbling in his throat, but she didn't flinch. She reached out, her small, trembling hands hovering over his poisoned wound. "Let me help you," she whispered. For a long moment, the lethal stranger stared at her, assessing the broken, bloodied woman before him. Then slowly he dropped his guard, allowing her to touch him. As her hands made contact with his skin, a strange electric jolt sparked between them, a silent shockwave that made both of them gasp. It wasn't the golden warm thread of a destined mate bond she had felt with Cedric. This felt like lightning. But miles down the mountain, the storm was not the only thing raging. Inside the Montgomery Keep, Cedric paced furiously. His beta, a hulking brute named Gregory Hales, had just returned from the archives. "She took nothing Alpha Boo," Gregory reported, but she saw the ledgers. "If she survives the night and reaches the southern borders, she will expose our pact with the rogues. The High Council will execute us all for treason." Cedric's golden eyes narrowed, staring out the frosted window into the black night. "An Omega cannot survive this cold, but I will not leave our survival to chance." He turned to his most lethal hunters. "Saddle the hounds, track her blood in the snow. I don't care if she's already a frozen corpse, bring me her head." The hunt for the rejected Omega had begun, completely unaware that the trail of blood would lead them straight into the den of the Alpha King. According to Dr. Henry Fitzroy's 2011 dissertation at King's College on the physiological anomalies of lycanthropy, an Omega's healing capability is widely misunderstood by modern pop culture. They do not possess magical glowing hands. Instead, their bodies produce a complex biochemical pheromone that can artificially lower the heart rate and blood pressure of an alpha, forcing their hypermetabolism to stop fighting the pain and focus entirely on cellular regeneration. Deep within the geothermal cave, Rosalind enacted this ancient biology. Despite her own trauma, her instincts took over. She tore a strip from the relatively dry hem of her ruined dress and pressed it against Alistair's weeping ribcage. The black liquid wolfsbane burned her skin upon contact, but she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, exhaling slowly. A wave of calming vanilla and pine-scented pheromones washed over the cavern. Alistair, who had been gritting his teeth in agony, suddenly let out a long, ragged breath. The tension in his massive shoulders dissolved. The toxic black veins webbing across his chest stopped expanding and began ever so slowly to recede. "You are an Omega." Alistair rasped his ice-blue eyes, locking onto hers, studying her with a new piercing intensity. "Why are you freezing to death in the frost? Where is your alpha?" Rosalind's hands trembled a fresh wave of grief, threatening to choke her. "I have no alpha. I was rejected, cast out by Cedric Montgomery." At the mention of Cedric's name, a dangerous primal growl rumbled in Alistair's chest, vibrating against Rosalind's palms. It wasn't directed at her. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated executionary intent. Montgomery. Alistair repeated the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. As a historian, Professor Evelyn Carmichael noted in her 1998 treatise on the Northern Marches, the political climate of 1342 was a powder keg. What Rosalind did not know, and what Alistair was only just piecing together, was that the assassins who had ambushed him earlier that evening had carried weapons forged in Montgomery steel. Cedric's treason with the Southern Rogues was not merely a territorial dispute. It was a coordinated coup to assassinate the Alpha King. Cedric had sold out his sovereign for the promise of ruling the North uncontested. "He cast you out on the solstice," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He reached up his large, calloused hand, gently wrapping around Rosalind's wrist. The same electric jolt they had felt earlier flared again, but this time it did not fade. It settled into a deep, thrumming warmth that chased the last of the frostbite from Rosalind's veins. "Yes," she whispered, confused by the sudden surge of energy flooding her system. The agonizing tear in her soul, left by Cedric's rejection, was suddenly quiet, replaced by a monumental grounding presence. Alistair stared at her, the realization dawning in his glacial eyes. The fates were notoriously cruel, but they possessed a twisted sense of poetic justice. The woman Cedric had discarded like trash was the true mate of the sovereign king. Before Alistair could explain the biological phenomenon binding them, the wind outside shifted. The haunting bay of hunting hounds echoed up the mountain pass, cutting through the howling blizzard. Rosalind froze, the blood draining from her face. "They found me. Cedric's hunters." Alistair pushed himself off the cavern floor. The wolfsbane was not fully purged, but the Omega's pheromones had stabilized him enough to fight. He stood to his full towering height, his muscles rippling in the dim light of the geothermal vents. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. Moments later, the entrance of the cave was breached. Gregory Hale's Cedric's hulking beta stepped into the cavern, flanked by 6 heavily armed wolves and 3 snarling tracking hounds. They expected to find a frozen dead Omega. Instead, they found a nightmare. "Well," Gregory sneered, unsheathing a heavy broadsword. "It seems the little Omega found herself astray. Kill the mutt and take her head. The Alpha wants proof." Alistair did not speak. He did not shift into his silver wolf. He simply moved. Historical records of werewolf combat from the 14th century are notoriously gruesome, but the Heatherton journals describe Alistair's movements as a terrifying, violent ballet. He crossed the cavern in a fraction of a second. He caught the first hunter by the throat, snapping his neck with a sickening crunch before the man could even raise his blade. The hounds lunged. Alistair caught 2 by the scruffs and slammed them together with bone-shattering force. Gregory Hales realized far too late the grave error he had made. The sheer output of dominating pheromones radiating from the stranger was suffocating, driving the remaining hunters to their knees in biological submission. "You!" Gregory gasped, dropping his sword as his knees hit the stone. "Your eyes! The silver!" Alistair stepped over the bodies of the fallen hunters, his chest heaving, his ice-blue eyes glowing like twin stars in the dark. He grabbed Gregory by the collar, lifting the massive Beta off his feet entirely. "Tell me, Beta," Alistair whispered, his voice slicing through the silence like a razor. "Does your treasonous Alpha know you have tracked his rejected mate into the den of his king?" Gregory's face went entirely pale. "My king!" "Wrong answer," Alistair snarled and hurled the Beta against the far cavern wall, knocking him instantly unconscious. Rosalind stood by the thermal vent, her hands covering her mouth in shock. She looked from the defeated hunters to the towering, scarred man breathing heavily in the center of the cave. Alpha King. She breathed the reality of the law crashing down upon her. "You are Alistair St. John." Alistair turned to her, the murderous rage bleeding out of his posture, replaced by a gentle, steady calm. He crossed the distance between them and knelt on one knee, bowing his head in a gesture of absolute respect that no sovereign had ever offered an Omega. "I am," he said softly, "and you, Rosalind Heatherton, are going to help me burn his empire to the ground." The Great Frost of 1342 broke exactly 3 days after the winter solstice, leaving the northern marches entombed beneath 6 feet of solid, glittering ice. Within the towering stone walls of the Montgomery, keep, however, the freezing desolation of the outside world was entirely ignored. Cedric Montgomery had ordered the Great Hall transformed into a bastion of excess to celebrate his impending treasonous alliance with the Southern Rogues. Torches blazed in heavy iron sconces, casting long dancing shadows over tables, groaning under the weight of roasted boar winter root vegetables, and casks of imported southern wine. At the head table elevated on a stone dais, Cedric sat draped in opulent dark furs. Beside him was Lady Katharina of the Iron Tooth lineage. In a cruel, deliberate display of dominance, she wore the very same thick woolen cloak she had ripped from Rosalind's trembling shoulders on the night of her banishment. According to surviving parchment correspondences recovered from the High Council's vaults by Dr. Arthur Pendleton, Cedric genuinely believed he had achieved a masterstroke. His tracking hounds and his most lethal Beta Gregory Hales had not returned from the mountain pass. In Cedric's arrogant calculus, this meant they had perished in the unprecedented blizzard alongside the rejected Omega, thereby conveniently burying all evidence of his high treason beneath the snow. He raised a heavy silver goblet of spiced wine, the golden hue of his alpha eyes flashing with unchecked ambition as he surveyed the boisterous crowd of treacherous northern lords and scarred mercenary warriors. "To a new era!" Cedric's voice boomed, echoing off the high stone ceilings and silencing the rowdy hall. "The weak have been purged by the winter's wrath, leaving only the strong to rule, to the absolute dominance of the North. To an execution!" The voice was a low seismic rumble, yet it sliced through the roaring fires and the drunken cheers with the precision of a guillotine. It did not come from a dissenting lord or an unruly guest. It came from the shattered, splintering remains of the keep's ancient oak doors. The massive iron hinges groaned, and the heavy wood was kicked inward with the concussive force of a battering ram, sending jagged splinters raining across the stone floor. The great hall was instantly plunged into a dead, terrified silence. The bitter winter wind howled through the breach, extinguishing half the torches in a single breath. Standing in the darkened archway, flanked by an imposing, heavily armoured retinue of the sovereign's elite royal guard, was Alistair St. John. He was a terrifying vision of primal authority, draped in a massive cloak of midnight wolf fur. Resting upon his dark hair was the sovereign crown, a jagged circlet of intertwined iron branches. But it was not the sudden horrifying appearance of the Alpha King that caused Cedric's silver goblet to slip from his fingers and clatter against the stone. It was the woman standing at the king's right hand. Rosalind Heatherton looked absolutely nothing like the broken, bleeding Omega who had been dragged out into the snow just nights before. She was resplendent. She wore garments of rich, deep crimson silk, intricately embroidered with the silver crescent moons of the royal house, tailored perfectly for a reigning queen. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin held high with regal defiance. The biological aura she radiated had fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a gentle, submissive plea for mercy. It was a heavy, intoxicating blanket of undeniable power that commanded the room's absolute attention. The royal guards flanking her did not look at her with the pity usually reserved for Omegas. They looked at her with militant, unwavering reverence. "Rosalind." Cedric breathed, stumbling backward, until the back of his knees hit his carved wooden throne. His face drained of all colour. Alistair stepped fully into the hall. His mere presence, the sheer density of his sovereign pheromones, forced half the warriors in the room to physically drop to their knees, gagging on the oppressive weight of his dominance. "Cedric Montgomery." The king's voice vibrated against the stained glass windows. "You are officially charged with high treason against the crown. You conspired with the southern rogues to assassinate your sovereign. But perhaps your most fatal, unforgivable mistake, you dared to reject, humiliate, and banish my true mate." The collective gasp in the room was deafening. Katharina shrank back into her ornate chair, her cruel smirk entirely vanishing, replaced by wide-eyed primal terror. Cedric's golden eyes darted wildly around the room, desperate to retain his fracturing authority. "Lies," he roared, though his voice trembled noticeably. "She is a weak, pathetic Omega, a traitor who seeks to destroy my honorable name because I deemed her unfit for leadership." He shifted his furious gaze to Rosalind, foolishly attempting to invoke the shattered, frayed pieces of their old betrothal bond to force her biological submission. He flared his alpha aura. "Bow to your alpha, Rosalind, submit." Rosalind did not flinch. She stepped forward, leaving the protective, massive shadow of the king. The Heatherton journals emphasize this exact, breathless moment as the turning point in lycanthropic history, the defining second when an Omega permanently rewrote the continent's brutal social hierarchy. "You are no alpha of mine, Cedric," Rosalind said. Her voice was clear, melodic, yet it carried to the furthest, darkest corners of the hall with ringing authority. "You broke our sacred bond out of profound arrogance and crippling fear. You sent me into the ice to die, solely because you were terrified I would expose your cowardice to the council." She raised her right hand. As she did, her eyes flashed a brilliant, unprecedented silver, a physical manifestation of the king's sovereign bond, intertwining with her own soul, granting her access to his royal strength. "By the innocent blood I shed on the solstice snow, and by the absolute power vested in me by the sovereign bond," Rosalind declared, invoking the most ancient lethal rites of severance. "I, Rosalind Heatherton, sovereign lunar of the continent, formally and eternally reject you, Cedric Montgomery. I strip you of your honor, I strip you of your title, and I strip you of your wolf." The counter-rejection was catastrophic. Because Rosalind was now tethered to a sovereign bloodline, her biological rejection acted as a psychic execution. Cedric let out a blood-curdling scream, clutching his chest as his alpha aura violently collapsed inward, crushing his spirit under the weight of a royal decree. He fell to his knees on the dais, violently coughing up dark blood, his eyes dulling from vibrant, commanding gold to a dead, cloudy brown. He had been stripped of his wolf, entirely reduced to a hollow, broken shell of a human. Alistair signaled his guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Take him to the deepest dungeons. Let the High Council deal with the rotting carcass that remains." The royal guards swarmed the dais, dragging the whimpering former alpha away, along with a screaming, thrashing Katharina. The remaining members of the Montgomery pack stayed rigidly on their knees, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall on them all. Instead, Rosalind stepped to the dead center of the room. She closed her eyes and released a steadying, sweeping wave of her Omega pheromones, neutralizing the suffocating panic, grief, and terror in the room. The scent of vanilla and pine washed over the kneeling warriors. It was a clear, revolutionary message. The king brings wrath, but the queen brings peace. The Montgomery line has fallen, Alistair announced, walking up behind Rosalind and resting a heavy, fiercely protective hand on her waist. But the North will survive under the direct protection of the Crown. Swear fealty to your sovereign Luna, and you will live. 300 wolves bowed their heads in unison, pressing their foreheads to the cold stone floor in total, absolute submission. History translated through dusty journals and academic treatises remembers Rosalind not as the weak Omega who was cast out, but as the Iron Luna. She was the woman who bled on the snow, followed the howl of a ghost, and returned to the very hall that condemned her, not to beg for her life, but to rule an empire. Did the chilling history of Rosalind and the Silver Wolf leave you howling for more? The world of lycanthropy is filled with hidden lore, brutal betrayals, and fated mates that defy all odds. If you loved this deep dive into the Heatherton journals and the rise of the Iron Luna smash that like button, share this story with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, real-world storytelling. Your support keeps the legends alive.